Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Talks at Pulitzer, featuring author Sonia Shah for a focus on her reporting on infectious disease outbreaks, climate change, and disrupted migration patterns. My name is Ann Peters, and I'm the University and Community Outreach Director at the Pulitzer Center. While we're waiting for more folks to join us, let us know on the chat where you're listening in from. Let us know what city you're residing in, what country you're from, and so forth, so we can get a sense of who's visiting with us today. It's really a pleasure to have Sonia with us for the third in our Science and Health series this month. If you missed last week's session with John Cohen, you'll find the video and an update by my colleague Holly Peipenberg at pulitzercenter.org. Well, you all are letting us know fast and furiously where you're calling, or not calling in from, but listening in from: Ohio, New Jersey, Waco, Texas, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, Orange County, California. So keep letting us know where you're listening in from. We also see Hawaii and Canada, Ottawa, Canada, San Francisco. So it's great to have all of you with us today. As a science journalist and author, Sonia Shah has been tracking the spread of pathogens for decades, including several Pulitzer Center supported projects on antibiotic-resistant pathogens in New Delhi and on cholera in Haiti. Among her longer works is the 2016 book Pandemic, Tracking New Contagions from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond. Her latest work grew out of a Pulitzer Center supported investigation into contagions facing Syrian and Afghan refugees trapped in Greece. That book is coming out in June, and it is titled The Next Great Migration: The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move. Sonia is part of a terrific group of journalists we've been honored to work with through the years and support, who are able to cover often underreported stories around the world, and who can bring significant expertise to their reporting and to the conversations like the one we will have today. If you've joined us for earlier talks you'll remember that we've grown quite a bit since we began in 2006, when we had just supported 9 reporting projects. Last year, that number went up to more than 180 projects, involving even more professional journalists, as many of the reporters worked in teams. We also had more than 40 reporting fellows from our campus consortium partner universities and colleges who completed their projects in nearly 30 countries. And then we have public events like today's session and educational programs involving thousands of students and teachers each year. For any teachers listening in, or parents of school-age children attempting distance learning, please check out our educational resources and printable lesson plans and news articles from our very busy K-12 team. Those include lessons on topics we'll be exploring today. And of course, you'll find all of the reporting and educational resources on our website at pulitzercenter.org. A few housekeeping matters. We wanted to let you know that Sonia will be speaking for about 20-25 minutes thereabouts, and then we'll have time for Q&A. You'll see a Q&A icon on your screen, and you can begin adding questions there throughout her remarks. So please go ahead and do just that. There's also the chat icon where you're letting us know where you're listening in from today. That's to tell us that, as well as if you have any technological issues. For example, all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, let us know via chat. Remember, the specific questions you have for Sonia will go in the Q&A button. Throughout this session, we'll continue to see that we're getting a lot of people from across the US and across the world, and we'll periodically let you know where those folks are from. We see Germany, New York, Missouri, Spokane, Washington, Ohio, London, Winchester, Virginia, Ann Arbor, Michigan. So that's great to see all of you here with us today. One final housekeeping matter is to let you know that we're recording this session today to post it online for others who could not join us today, or if you want to come back and listen in on it. We'll also have a brief survey once we wrap up to help us learn how we can better serve your interests. So please stay on the line once this session ends. And now I'd like to welcome Sonia Shah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's so exciting to see all the names coming up on the chat. So keep those coming in. I see lots of new friends and old friends from all over the world. So it's fantastic to be here. I'll just start my PowerPoint now. Yeah. Let's see. Give me 2 seconds. How's that? Are you guys seeing the screen? Hello?
Sonia, I think you need to share again.
I need to share again. Okay, sorry. Tell me when I'm close. How's that?
Perfect.
Great. Okay. So I just want to give you guys sort of the backstory of the kind of work I've been doing for the past years in with support from Pulitzer Center and others. I started out writing about pathogens and infectious diseases, mostly because I was interested in the politics of disease. I was interested in why populations are so unequal within societies and also across societies. And looking at pathogens and how they spread really helped me understand that. So the first book I wrote on contagious diseases was a book called The Fever, and I did reporting on, that was the story of malaria, which is of course one of our oldest pathogens. We probably had it since we evolved from the apes, and we still to this day have hundreds of thousands of people who fall ill with malaria every year. And that is despite the fact that we've known how to prevent it for hundreds of years, and we've had treatments to cure it for at least that long as well. Nevertheless, because it's a disease of poverty, we don't really have a lot of political will to deal with malaria today. Let's see, oh, right. So I've reported on malaria outbreaks all over the world, and what we were seeing is this like really interesting relationship between malaria and poverty, where if you're poor, you're more likely to get malaria because of course you live in places like what I've shown on the screen here, which is a Cuna village in Panama, where there was an outbreak of drug-resistant falciparum malaria, which is the most deadly kind of malaria. And you can see that the living conditions contribute to that, in the sense that if you're poor and you live in a place where you don't have window screens and you're going to be more vulnerable to the bites of mosquitoes, these are places where there's poor drainage, so there's standing water around, that's where mosquitoes breed. So in all those ways, being poor means you're more likely to get malaria. But what I learned through this reporting is also that malaria itself makes you poor. And this has actually been quantified by economists who've shown that just having malaria in your society reduces GDP growth by a couple of percentage points every year. I think it's 1.3% every year. And that's year after year after year after year. So if you look at just a disease like malaria alone, it really goes a long way to explaining why, you know, some of us live in prosperity and some of us live in kind of dire poverty. I started reporting on novel pathogens, new pathogens that are emerging, and old pathogens moving into new places around 2010. And at that time, it became clear that something new was happening in terms of the human sort of confrontation with the microbial world. Since 1940, there's been hundreds of pathogens that have either kind of reemerged into new places where they'd never been seen before, or just wholly new that science had never seen at all. So these reemerging pathogens included things like cholera, which erupted in Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake. And that's kind of what first piqued my interest, is this very old pathogen, but suddenly coming into this whole new place. And it was this completely vulnerable population in the sense that they had had no experience of it. So they had no sort of acquired immunities to it, either biological or social. And this was really of a piece with what was going on around the world with outbreaks of new kinds of disease. There was cholera in Haiti. Then, of course, we also saw Ebola in West Africa, where it had never been seen before. We've had Zika in the Americas, where it had never been seen before. We've had new kinds of coronaviruses, SARS in 2002, and now today's coronavirus. We've had new kinds of tick-borne illnesses, new kinds of mosquito-borne disease. The list kind of goes on and on. And so what I wanted to look at is, how does a microbe, which is, you know, this microscopic creature that has no independent locomotion of its own, become this, you know, intruder that causes so much death and disruption? And of course, our living conditions play a big role. You can see this is some reporting I did in Haiti after the cholera outbreak, where you know, the lack of sanitation plays a huge role in allowing cholera to spread. But it's not just that, it's also the way people are intruding into wildlife habitat and creating new connections between the human body, the bodies of livestock, and the bodies of wild animals. And avian influenza is a really good example of that. Avian influenza is a virus of waterfowl. It lives in waterfowl quite harmlessly, doesn't cause them any sickness. But when the virus in waterfowl drops into, say, a factory farm full of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of captive chickens, it starts to spread really quickly. And because it's a virus, it mutates, it replicates as it mutates as it replicates, and it can become much more virulent. And this is a process that's so kind of you know, predictable that scientists can actually recreate it in a lab setting. And so what's happening in places like South China, which is what this photograph is from, is some reporting I did in South China, where you have people living with livestock and exposed to wild animals in new kinds of ways that make these spillovers more likely. And this was an illegal pig farming colony in South China. It was built on land, you know, these people were squatting there with kind of tacit permission from the nephew of a Communist Party leader. And these long shacks that they lived in actually were with the pigs that they tended. And in the summers, they would take the roofs off. And so outside of these kind of long huts, they had ponds, and they would use those as sort of manure lagoons to dump all the pig waste into. But of course, they also were really nice for a passing duck. And so with the roofs open in the summer and these ponds of sort of manure lagoons right next to them, there was a very easy transmission of microbes between passing ducks, waterfowl, the pigs that were, you know, livestock, and the humans who actually lived in these shacks with them. And that is the kind of epidemiology of influenza, basically, that hatches new influenza viruses, not just out of, you know, pigs' bodies, but also out of farmed chickens, as poultry farming has been a huge contributor to the spread of these avian influenza viruses. And you know, with people living in closer contact with livestock and with wildlife, it's these spillovers and these new pathogens are emerging with increasing frequency. And it's driven really by human expansion, that we have, you know, kind of paved over so much of wildlife habitat. And that's, of course, why we have this huge extinction crisis with 150 species being lost every day. But it also means that the wildlife that remains has to crowd closer and closer to where we live. And that just makes it more likely that we can hunt them more easily, we can trade them more easily, we can farm them more easily. And we just have this interface that's becoming sort of more and more intense. And that's a big driver of why we're having so many of these new pathogens today. From, you know, avian influenza is one, but also SARS. And then the other major driver of new pathogens today is antibiotic resistant pathogens. So when I was doing my book on pandemic, in my reporting, I spoke to a lot of infectious disease experts, and I would always ask them, you know, what's the pathogen that keeps you up at night? What's going to be the next big one, you know? And they almost always gave me one of two answers. The first was a respiratory pathogen that spreads like influenza, but is just a little bit more deadly than our seasonal influenza. And that's exactly what we're seeing today with coronavirus. But the second one they would always say is a highly drug-resistant bacterial pathogen. And so I did some reporting around that, and I saw in New Delhi kind of the living conditions that allow these pathogens to spill over. These are places, in this photograph is a small slum outside of a major medical complex area in New Delhi. And this is a place where people are living very close together. They're exposed to each other's waste a lot because they don't have good sanitation. And because they're poor, they don't necessarily, they're not able to finish an entire course of antibiotics. So they buy antibiotics and maybe they'll have one or two. And that means that the bacterial pathogens around in these communities, whatever doesn't kill them kind of makes them stronger. And this leads to more and more antibiotic resistant pathogens emerging. And the other big driver is industrial agriculture, which is a huge driver here in the United States, although probably less so in places like India. But what's interesting about that is how these pathogens are carried around the world. In the case of the antibiotic resistant pathogens that I studied in New Delhi, one way that pathogen started to spread into dozens of countries around the world was through medical tourism. There was, a bunch of companies that were exploiting the fact that patients in America, in Western Europe, parts of the Middle East, and Latin America couldn't afford elective surgeries because of bad insurance or underfinanced health systems at home. It was actually cheaper for them to fly to India and get their knee replacement surgery or their hip replacement or these elective surgeries done in India, and then fly back home. And so all these hospitals are kind of sprung up to kind of feed this new industry of medical tourism, and by this trade in surgeries, essentially, antibiotic resistant pathogens were able to spread around the world, and we see that with all kinds of pathogens. So this is a recreation of a flu pandemic, and you can see that when a pathogen emerges in one part of the world, it can very rapidly spread across the globe on the flight network, however, for whatever reason that we're flying, whether it's for medical tourism or business travel or whatever. And in fact, the flight network is so influential in shaping how pandemics unfold that you can actually predict where a pathogen will strike next, where an epidemic will strike next, just by measuring the number of direct flights between infected and uninfected cities. So this map that I'm showing you here is the same simulated flu pandemic that was on the previous slide, but in this map, the cities are arranged according to their direct flight connections. And I'm just going to play it, and you can see when you play that same simulation of the flu pandemic on this kind of map, it resolves into this kind of perfect series of waves, because the flight network is so influential in shaping how pandemics unfold. And it's not just people who move things around. We also have animals are moving around in all kinds of new ways now. This is a map of the flyways of North American migratory birds and North American migration routes. And these have been implicated in the spread of contagions as well, like avian influenza viruses that have come over from Asia into North America, carried in migratory birds. And animals are also starting to move in new ways, and that something that started to become interesting to me after I wrote my book Pandemic, which came out in 2016. I wanted to look more closely at the issue of movement and how we move and how that plays a role in nature and history and contagions generally. And so what we're seeing now is that we have a lot more people on the move today than ever before. This is a simulation of, this is actual data from global refugee movements between 2010 and 2016 from the UNHCR. And we have more people moving around and moving out of their countries of birth than ever before. And that's driven by a wide range of factors, and climate change being one of the sort of incipient ones that are going to start moving people around. So in 2015, just as I was finishing my book on pandemic, we saw what was called the quote unquote migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. That was, the Syrian civil war and the Arab Spring had opened up new migration pathways. They had this sort of bottleneck of migration across the Mediterranean Sea around 2015. And it was kind of universally called the migrant crisis. You know, it was considered this catastrophic thing. There's all these people moving around. And I started doing some research and reporting on the health status of some of these people on the move. I went to Greece and talked to refugees living, they were stuck in these detention centers across Greece and dotted around Southern Europe after the EU decided to close its borders and not let them through. And what I wanted to understand is whether their movements could start to spread, what kind of disruptive effect that would have. Would that cause pathogens to spread? Would there be outbreaks of disease? And what I found is actually in places like in Greece, this is a hurricane shelter I visited in Bahamas when I was doing some reporting on the Haitian hurricane survivors of Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas, who are living in, you know, pretty rudimentary, tough conditions, and this is months after the hurricane passed. But what I found is that far from sort of spreading disease, that it was really the conditions that people were living in that were making these people sick. That in fact, the people on the move are healthier than the host societies they enter. And that's something called the healthy migrant effect. It's very well documented. And when you think about it, it makes sense because migration itself requires health. It requires good health. It requires strength. It requires innovation and resilience, all of these things. And people who migrate have a lot of those qualities. You know, they have the qualities that allow them to migrate. So it makes a lot of sense when you think about it that migrants are generally healthier than the host societies they enter. But it really is the opposite of what the conventional wisdom is. And that kind of led to this new book that is coming out in June about the role of migration in nature and history, and how we have thought about migration as such a negative phenomenon for so long, and why that is. And what I found is that sort of across the board, we have underestimated the scale and the pace of migrations, not just of animals, but also of humans. So, you know, when we first started thinking about migration in human history, the idea was that we hadn't migrated at all. Like if you look back in Linnaeus times in the 18th century, the early taxonomists said that, you know, people evolved in all the different places where they occurred. There wasn't any migration at all. We all just kind of emerged wherever we were. Slowly, we've pieced together a story that's radically different from that. Of course, when I was a kid, the idea was that, well, we originated in Africa and we moved out of Africa. We had this one migration out of Africa, settled all of the continents of the world that were basically empty at the time. And once we filled them all up, we stopped moving in this long period of being still and sedentary until sort of modern navigational technology allowed us to start moving again, and that was really an outcome of sort of modern life. But what we're learning now over the past just handful of years, piecing together through DNA studies, and even more importantly, the ability we now have to recover and analyze ancient DNA, so we can recover a lot more of the story of migration that's embedded in our chromosomes. And what paleogeneticists have found is that there wasn't just one migration out of Africa, but really this series of waves of migration that are pictured here. And we've created a bunch of maps for the book across the planet and also into each continent. That it didn't stop when the continents were kind of already habitated, but people kept coming. There was waves and waves back and forth. And even that first migration out of Africa actually wasn't a migration into unsettled nothingness and, you know, empty lands, but in fact, there was other earlier human species already living in those places too. So this process of migration has been going on continuously throughout our history, and not just provoked by sort of desperation and scarcity, which I think is part of the kind of negative narrative about migration, is that we only do it when we're really, really desperate, when we have no other choice. And I think the the reconstructed history of migration into the Pacific is really telling on that count. Now, the early ideas about how people got to, say, Polynesia was that it must have been by mistake, that they drifted there accidentally and, happened to find this speck of land in the middle of the Pacific, and that's how, the Pacific was populated. But what we're now uncovering through genetic evidence and archaeological evidence is that people started migrating into the Pacific much earlier than previously thought, and had many waves of migration. So it wasn't just one time by accident, but several waves of migration that continued over thousands and thousands of years. And those are just the migrations that we know of because they were successful. Of course, there were probably many, many more that were not successful. So the scale of migration was just much greater than anyone ever believed before. And you see this throughout, like, this piecing together of human history. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how Linnaeus named our species Homo sapiens as, the wise ape. But a more apt name might have been Homo migratio, because we're such a migratory species. We're really the ape that moves around. So our migration history has been underestimated greatly, but also what we're learning is that our understanding of animal migrations and movements has been underestimated too. And this is something we're learning now because of GPS and solar tags, which have allowed scientists to attach tiny little tags that get solar energy onto animals and track their movement in real time through GPS. That was something that was just not possible in the past. And what they're discovering is that in almost every study on animal movement, that animals are moving faster, farther, and in more complex ways than anyone ever imagined. And there's this amazing data bank called MoveBank, where all the movement ecologists actually gather their data on animal movements. And this little video just showed some of it, some of the tracks of animals that they found around the world. And actually, they recently sent up a satellite with the International Space Station, and that's going to be gathering data from thousands of animals that have been tagged around the world, and collecting real-time data, watching, just kind of tracking where they're moving. So they're calling that kind of like an internet of animals. So we can see the planet sort of covered with this, network that's fluid and dynamic and moving all the time. And it's really very different than the idea of movement that is traditional in our sort of conventional politics, and certainly in our ideas about contagion. And we can see this in how we've responded to the coronavirus, for example, where kind of the reflexive response has been to try to contain it by shutting it down, closing the borders, shutting down the flights. And it's almost, it's almost comical how, if it weren't so sad, it would be comical how tardy we are in doing that. I mean, if you look at this is a visualization that the New York Times put together, but it shows that, 7 million people left Wuhan before the city was on lockdown. And they tracked kind of how people moved around the world as the virus spread with them. And in almost every case, people were moving and bringing this microbe around with them well before political leaders thought okay, now we'll close it down. It's like we're closing the door after everyone has moved already. And I think it's because there's this huge background of movement that we have not really grappled with as a society. And our responses to contagion is sort of to reflexively say, well, close it down, isolation, try to contain it and stop it. But what we see is that there's so much movement going on that we're not recognizing, that containment is actually not possible. And overall, while the best we've been able to do with this pathogen is slow it down. And that, I call that in one of my books, I call that approach of the biomedical approach to infectious disease as kind of a form of microbial xenophobia, where the idea is to isolate the microbe and arrest its movement and try to kind of build walls and borders around it, and then douse it with killing chemicals. And I think you can see that sort of on a larger scale with how we deal with the movement of people. And so we see, like, this is a map showing all of the refugee movements around the world. And, you know, these are going to be becoming only greater in scale and pace as the climate crisis progresses, because the habitability of the planet is changing, and we are going to need to move in order to survive that. But because we think of migration as sort of a crisis automatically, you know, we think of it as disastrous without really grappling with, do societies have the absorptive capacity for new people to come into them? Would it be life-saving for those migrants to move? Would it create more resilient societies in the ones that they enter and the ones they leave behind? And so we don't look at that whole picture. Instead, we kind of focus on the negative parts, and we say, well, this is disruptive, this is, you know, this is catastrophic, everyone needs to stay where, quote unquote, where they belong, which is that old idea of like each kind of people belonging in a certain place. And so what we've seen with, like, as refugee movements and human migrations have increased in scale, that the response kind of across the board has been to build more walls. And this map shows all of the walls that have been built around the world since the end of World War II. And it's, you know, it's not just in the US or in Europe, it's really everywhere that this is happening. But another interesting part of the outcome of the wall building that we're seeing today is that it doesn't actually deter migration, that people keep moving even when the borders are closed and even when the migration routes are shut down, but they're kind of circumvented into more deadly places. So migration becomes more deadly. It doesn't end, but it gets, like, the death toll rises. So this map shows all the migrant deaths that have occurred in the last few years. Between 1998 and 2018, over 20,000 people likely died trying to cross into the United States. About 36,000 people likely died trying to get into Europe. So there's this, you know, false idea that if we close the borders and build the walls, we'll keep the virus in, we'll keep the people in, that we can contain it all. But in fact, you know, what I want to suggest in this new work I'm doing is maybe the answer is just the opposite. Maybe migration isn't the crisis, but migration is actually the solution. And I think as climate change progresses, that we're going to need to really reimagine how we think about the role of migration in nature and history, and to rethink it as, you know, part of our biological resilience, and part of being sort of adaptive to changing circumstances is going to be being able to move. And this map kind of captures that for me. It's a map that shows where wild species are going to be moving because of climate change. And I think we haven't mapped out where people are going to be moving, because it all depends on our politics and our political choices. But in the end, you know, I think if we can kind of come out of this period of closure and isolation that we're living in right now, and I think so many of us are feeling the trauma of that, that maybe we can rethink what it means to move around and to be connected and to come into new places, and that there are costs to that, but that there also are so many benefits as well. Thank you for listening. Let me turn my share screen off, and I'm happy to take any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much, Sonia. That was there were some questions that came up in the Q&A that you ultimately hit on, and just that your idea of creating more resiliency rather than these roadblocks is really beneficial as a thought changer, so to speak. And there were these questions of, Monica had a question about whether if the flight paths had been closed sooner, would that have changed things? You touched on that, but maybe do you want to elaborate a little bit more in terms of some of that information there that you were gathering as you were watching these things, both in terms of your book and then in terms of what you were seeing right as things were happening over these last few months?
I mean, I don't think that there's been any respiratory pathogen that we've actually been able to contain as such in the history of sort of pandemics. You know, we have,
Mhm.
I mean, if you just look at flu virus, the seasonal flu virus, for example, and we have that every year. And even though we have sort of some degree of herd immunity that we've acquired over, you know, at great cost to our health, we've acquired that over time, even though we have a scientific establishment that creates a whole new flu vaccine every year, we still lose billions and billions of dollars to sickness from flu every year, and we lose 500,000 people every year to flu. And that's for something that happens year after year after year. So I think given that example, I think the idea of containing a respiratory pathogen that spreads just from people moving around and talking to each other, just the social contacts that happen, is really very difficult. And you know, we've never been able to do it, even though we've had lots of opportunity to try and lots of incentive to try, because the you know, influenza is hugely costly to our societies.
On your points about the idea that the individuals who are coming and migrating are actually the healthier than when they're coming to the host country, what has your research shown in terms of healthcare systems or efforts, whether governmental or intergovernmental, of individuals who are realizing that, or are you seeing no response to that?
It's exactly the opposite. So I think because a lot of political leaders think of migration as sort of, you know, that migrants are coming into their societies because they're attracted by some special benefits that they'll get from getting there. You know, that there's this, if they're coming to steal our jobs or they're coming to get our healthcare, and there's all these goodies, these attractants that pull them in. And so when they don't want them to come, there's these policies of deprivation that get put into place. And we see that across countries like in Europe and in the US as well, that the ordinary healthcare that's available to citizens is not available to newly arrived people and migrants, whether they're documented or not documented. You know, even things that would protect all of us better, like vaccination programs. Undocumented people, undocumented children across Europe don't get, you know, the routine vaccinations in a lot of countries that residents do. So this idea of, and I think it comes out of this idea about migration as being this negative phenomenon that we have to deter. And also that if we don't give them any goodies and deprive them, that they're going to stop coming, which is also not, you know, not what I found at all. It's exactly the opposite of that.
We've had a lot of questions. I think people are really fascinated too by the maps that you were showing in terms of migration, human animal interactions as well. We have one question from B that relates to whether you came across any interesting research regarding vaccination for animals, and how that might make a difference of preventing these disease outbreaks.
Well,
and whether it makes it worse because of, because of extensive use of antibiotics.
Well, yeah, those are two separate things I see there.
Right.
One point to clarify is that these microbes that become pathogens in humans are not pathogenic in the animal reservoirs. They're, you know, they're harmless to the animals. So there wouldn't be any role of vaccination, because it's not like the animal already has immunity. You know, the wildlife, the bats are not falling sick with Ebola. They, you know, they're the reservoir of Ebola. So that's part of, you know, so that's kind of a separate part. In terms of antibiotic consumption in agriculture, it's a huge driver of antibiotic resistant pathogens. Here in the United States, about 80% of the antibiotics that we consume as a country are used in commercial applications in agriculture. So farmers giving antibiotics to their animals to fatten them up for market faster. And we know that in countries where that practice is not allowed, that they don't have problems with antibiotic resistant bacteria the way we do here in the United States. So I think it's a huge driver, and it's really, you know, something that scientists realized in the very beginning when they first discovered antibiotics, that if you use them in ways that are not medically necessary, that you will provoke the evolution of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And that's basically what we have been doing here in the United States over the past like decades. So, and I think it's sort of a, you know, it's a ticking bomb, really.
Your presentation spurred a couple of folks really focused on your process as well, of both the research, the interviewing, and Roberto has asked, what is your process both pre-research and post when you're going to countries that you visited, and how do you undertake these interviews in oftentimes situations where, as you pointed out, to the Haitian refugees or individuals in refugee camps who have already been traumatized. So maybe you could go through some of your pre-reporting and when you're in the field, your process for folks. I know it might take longer than just a few moments, so whatever you can share, I think people are really keen to know.
I mean, I guess in a nutshell, my process is, to do a ton of background research before I go into any of these places. So to do all of the background reading and to talk to all the experts I can on the phone and to talk to community leaders in the places that I'm going to before, so I have established my background level of understanding of the communities and what their own priorities are. And I've also established social contact with like the leaders in those communities, or, the people who are kind of networked into those communities, so that when I go there, it's also because, like, I don't have like months of funding to report on these places. Like, I'll go for a week or two tops. So it really needs to be like concentrated once I'm on the ground. So making all those contacts like for weeks or months before I actually go do the reporting is really critical. And then the other part of it, I think, is just being, making enough time to really listen. So, and it's not the most efficient thing to do, but if you go to, say, a hurricane shelter, you have traumatized people who have lost everything, and you just need information about, one part of their experience, you can't just extract that. Like, you have to sit down and establish trust and really listen to what people want to say. Because I think, people want to be listened to, but they don't want to just give you the one piece of information that you want. So you have to have the patience to kind of sit there and really listen to all of it and absorb it and respond, in a humane way, and to take it seriously. I think that's the only way that and even as a journalist, I feel that's how you get a more complete picture of what's going on, even if like your angle is, well, I'm really just looking at, this one aspect of your experience. You have to kind of take the time to understand the whole piece of it, I think.
Michelle asks, she's very thankful for you speaking and presenting your work. And she says, the circumstances you've described are grim. Can you share some policies or advocacy you've seen anywhere in the world that would offer some hope for tackling some of these issues? This may also include any governmental or intergovernmental responses, perhaps, that you've seen, whether it's now or when you were looking at such things as Zika and other situations.
Well, yeah, I do see hopeful signs everywhere. And I also am the one thing I keep in mind always is that history doesn't progress in this kind of linear fashion. So there's always these unexpected outcomes, and little things can have outsized effects in ways that you don't imagine. So, I always try to keep that in mind when things seem really grim. One thing that I find really hopeful in the present moment is that what we've seen over the past few years is this idea of science being this elite activity, and we've seen this backlash against science around the world with these like right-wing populist leaders coming into power and saying, well, we don't need to do vaccines, and we don't need to listen to the science, and we don't need experts, and we don't need all these like environmental regulations or whatever it is, all that pointy-headed sciencey stuff. Like, we don't need it. And I think it grows in part out of the elitism that is inherent in the scientific establishment, that, the scientific establishment itself is complicit in to some extent of like trying to kind of elevate its authority and say, well, we're going to speak in lingo that none of you people can understand. And like, you have to go, you have to study for years and years to even know what we're talking about. And I think that dynamic is not helpful for us as a society. And I'm very hopeful about the fact that that's starting to change. I think scientists themselves are starting to become involved in the political process. And we've seen like scientists are running for office now and they're speaking out more, and they're realizing that like, I can't just stay in my ivory tower and like come up with this, you know, fancy paper that 10 people are going to read. Like I need to actually engage with the policy part of it. And then on the other side, we're also seeing the democratization of science. So we're seeing citizens and regular people starting to be empowered around science. And this is coming out of the climate movement, I think, primarily the environmental movement and the climate movement, where people are learning about, you know, atmospheric chemistry and like how, you know, how energy works and thermodynamics and all these things that were considered like really sciencey. Well, now that's all stuff that we all kind of have to know about, and we're all starting to do that. And I think we're seeing that now with public health. You know, we're all getting a crash course in epidemiology right now. Which I think, you know, just a few years ago would have been considered like a very obscure part of the scientific establishment that we didn't have to think about. And I think what my work has always been about is like, we all need to be engaged in science, and we have to be civil society has to be part of the scientific process. It shouldn't be two separate things. And so the fact that these things are sort of colliding and starting to meld a little bit more, I find that, I think that's a hopeful movement that's happening now.
Well, this has gone by so quickly, but that's a great statement to end on, because we had a goodly number of questions. We didn't get to all of the questions. We're going to have the recording of today's session with Sonia, and maybe some additional questions we can answer in our blog post. But I just want to thank you, Sonia, for being with us today, and for our audience as well. And to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, our producer for today. We just wanted to, hopefully our audience can stay with us a little bit longer. We wanted to let you know that we have a couple of things coming up next week, both in terms of change of conversation. Next Monday, we're going to be looking at Saudi Arabia with one of our journalist grantees, Krithika Varagar. We'll also continue our session on science and health next Friday, May 1st, with Amy Maxman, who's a senior reporter at Nature, who will be talking about coronavirus testing. We should mention that, as well as her broader reporting also on infectious disease outbreaks and social and governmental and medical responses. And we also want you to stay a couple more minutes, our audience, afterwards, to share in our survey to let us know what you're thinking about, and how we can, again, better serve your interests and to support you. We thank you for joining us today, and this is one way you can support the Pulitzer Center, obviously, by hearing about the great journalists that we work with and their additional reporting and the book that Sonia has coming out. And remember, we are a nonprofit journalism organization, and we also depend on your donor support. So just wanted to put that out there. We want to thank you for being with us all today, and we're going to sign off for the afternoon. So have a good day. Thank you.